Have you ever walked outside and stared at the night sky and thought, what kind of stars are there? I have. And that's what drew me to learning about astronomy and making it a career. But the universe offers stars in different kinds of flavors. Our sun is an average yellow star with an average size, but there are other kinds of larger and bluer stars. But we also see smaller and dimmer red stars. But we now know in 2025 that the universe looks like something where for every 2 blue stars, we see nearly 10 yellow sun-like stars, and we see about 50 red stars. So if you were to go outside, take out your telescope, and look at the sky, you actually won't see that because your instrument that you use, the telescope, is limited to nearby and brighter stars. The further away and the dimmer stars are not going to be visible to you. And you might think, well, actually, there's not that many red stars. This is selection bias. Factors that don't exist in your control or limitations in your instrument may create a sample that is not really true and give you wrong conclusions about the way the world works. And we can see that in society. If I was to ask you what space agencies you might know about or talk about, you probably heard of NASA, SpaceX with its Falcon rockets, or some of you might have heard of the European space agencies. But out there also exist other Russian agencies like Roscosmos, or the Indian space agency called ISRO, or the Japanese or the Chinese launching several rockets over the last decade. But you may never heard of this. And this because they are dimmer and further away agencies that you probably never heard about. One thing I like to tell my students, the Indian Space Agency launched a Martian satellite a few years ago. And that cost to launch that satellite was less than what it cost Hollywood to make the Martian movie. But some of you might not have heard about that is because you're unaware of this information. Now, this is not the only kind of bias. When you collect information, no matter the bias in it, you establish a belief system. You may have a topic that you deeply care about, and the reality is, for that same topic, there exist all the facts and evidence about it. But we're humans. We only accept those information and evidence that make sense to us and fit our belief system. But we also ignore all those information that doesn't make any sense. This is confirmation bias. And we see this all the time in society. Astronomers went through this centuries ago. For the longest time, we thought the Earth was the center of the world. Everything went around us. And it wasn't until Galileo in the 1600s, when he invented the telescopes, found the phases of Venus, found the Jupiter and its moons, we realized, wait a second, the sun is the center. So why was that? Well, for one, we see Earth has a night sky, and we see every night the sun, moon, and stars go around it. So that makes sense. Everything orbits us. But primarily, the reason we thought that was the religious scriptures that told us that the Earth was the center. And we had to make sense of it. It's actually baffling. Back in 2nd BC, we knew and saw evidence of the way the world works, and we rejected it. We saw the retrograde motion of Mars. And what is that, you may ask? Well, when you see Mars in the night sky, over the years, we see it go around it, but go back and forth. And actually, astronomers like Ptolemy made complicated models, saying that Mars must go in a little loop to make sense as having Earth in the center. And Galileo figured that out. In fact, Galileo's discovery was so heretic, he was imprisoned until his death. And so you may ask, well, Aman, that was 400 years ago. We figured it out. Why does that matter? To that I say, we still see confirmation bias in this day. And I'll take something that may seem obvious, but it's still not true. Global warming is actually considered not as true for a subsection of society. Climate change is considered hoax for some folks. And the arguments they propose is, well, wait a second. We see winter every single year. If global warming is real, why do we still get cold seasons? They also say, well, might think that the models they say are not reliable, or that Earth is going through natural heating and cooling process, and therefore global warming is not real. But what reality is, there's enormous amounts of evidence that show that the temperatures on the global scale is constantly rising, We see weather events constantly getting worse and worse, tornadoes, floods, earthquakes. And what we also see is sea levels decreasing and ice levels also decreasing. But I want you to think this, just because you see snow doesn't mean global warming doesn't exist. Take this US senator, for example, who walked into Senate halls and said, I have a snowball. How can global warming be real? And this is an example of him succumbing to the confirmation bias that how can humans cause this? When the fact of the matter is, it is real and we know that. And you may say, well, this is a global problem, Aman. Why do you care? Let me make it personal. I come from India, and I came to the US 9 years ago. And I noticed a certain way how folks here talk about people from other countries. If you were to ask an average person here, what do you think of the United States? They might talk about the beautiful urban cities or the gorgeous national parks that they have here. And you ask the same person, well, what do you think about other countries? And they'll point out to the litter problem or the homelessness that those countries may have. Now, if you believe me, without questioning what I just said, there might be some internal bias going on here. Because what I'm showing you on the left is images of Mumbai and its skyline and the Himalayas. And on the right, you see New York and San Francisco. And this is precisely my point. These kind of biases is what media taps into to propagate stereotypes. A few years ago, I watched the movie Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And for those who haven't seen this movie, a section of it takes place in India, set in the 1930s, where Indiana is given dinner and some of the food offering were monkey brains and soups of eyeballs. My grandpa was born in the 1930s, and I thought, did my grandpa eat monkey brains? And the answer is obviously no, and it's humorous, but that's exactly the point. This is how media is able to propagate the stereotypes that we may still have, that the society in the 80s thought that was so convincing or normalized that it wasn't baffling to see that kind of imagery. So let me give you one more example of how bias exists in astronomy. In the 1920s, there were two prominent astronomers, Harlow Shapley and Herbert Curtis, and they had this debate about how the universe worked. Harlow, using all the evidence he gathered, said, well, the Milky Way is just a large galaxy, and there's only one. And other galaxies like Andromeda could not be another galaxy. Instead, they were just a blob of gas. And he also said that the sun goes around the Milky Way like other stars. Now, Curtis heard this and argued back, said, hold on. Milky Way, Andromeda, they're all galaxies, and they're smaller than we think. And Curtis also said the sun was actually at the center of the Milky Way. That was 100 years ago. We now have Hubble and all kinds of modern discoveries that we know who got it right and who got it wrong. In fact, both astronomers got some things right and some things wrong. And that's exactly the point, that if you notice, the universe does what it wants to do. We astronomers get things wrong, get things right. Shapley could not believe how far the galaxies need to be, and therefore said that that galaxy cannot exist. It has to be a blob of gas, because back in 1920, it was incomprehensible to consider the distances between galaxies. But when astronomers get things wrong, notice something. We're all fine. We can fix ourselves. But that's not the case for other policies. Having biased opinions can have consequential impacts in our society. And so I implore you to consider what kind of bias you might still have. Think about the opposing views and make sure the opinion you have is of your own and not because somebody else told you to. Look into the selection bias of your instrument that you use to gather information. And if I can leave you something with my talk, let it be this. All information will always be biased, but what you can do is identify your bias and minimize it.